happy to share with you some of the research studies on the topic of congruency or fit and discrepancy. So let's see how it all comes together. First, okay. So first, I want to ask you to engage in a thought exercise. It's okay for you not to share the answers. I will not be looking in the chat. This is just something for us to think about. So imagine, for some reason, okay, and it still didn't work. Okay, so apologies for animation. So I will just take you through the full slide. So imagine I'm feeling very generous today, and I have given you $100. And so now you're thinking about this $100, and would you say that's a lot of money? And then imagine a slightly different scenario. You happen to be at Oprah's show, and she also decides to give you $100. Now, do you think that's a lot of money? But let's add a twist to this thought experiment. What if I give you $100, but your friend I will give $1,000? Now, do you think $100 is a lot of money? So this brings us to the idea that when we examine something, when we judge something, that sometimes we can reflect on it in absolute value, but oftentimes we also consider the context or consider relativity. We consider the comparison to relative to what? And that refers to not just the $100 bill, but to a variety of psychological concepts. So I have this example here on slide, the Google company is known for its culture of emphasis for creativity. It also is known for having a variety of wonderful, wonderful perks on its campus, in its headquarters, like ping pong tables, napkin pods, buffet, lunch buffets, smoothie stations, and so forth. And when looking anecdotally at some of the discussions between employees of Google, some of them reported as the happiest place on earth. I know, competing with Disney. And others really feel that it's manipulative, that Google, by providing a variety of services, including dry cleaning, is really trying to keep them working and blurring the boundaries between work and family. So we have this wonderful place that is perceived and experienced by people differently. Then in the movie context, Andy, one of the main characters, in Devil Wears Prada, received this wonderful, prestigious job that she always coveted for. But throughout the movie, we see that she is becoming really unhappy and disenchanted, and she feels that this is not a really good environment for her. And of course, on the left, this is a picture of my son from many years ago, where we see him showing different outcomes when it comes to emotions. On his first day of kindergarten, he's quite unhappy. And then we see him quite happy when he's fishing and doing his favorite activity. So throughout all of these examples, including with our thought exercise, we can see the theme of individuals bringing something into their own experiences, as well as the context. And as psychologists, we, of course, interested in studying what impacts how we feel, how we behave, and how we think. So with focusing on predicting an individual factor's impact on behaviors, thoughts, and outcomes, we can take person-centered. We're taking person-centered approach. You're not seeing the slides? I'm not.
We can see the slide, person and environment.
Yeah.
Person. Yeah. Okay.
Perfect. Yes. So then when we're looking at the context, we are considering environment-centered approach. And one of the most prominent early contributors to psychology, Kurt Lewin, has proposed the interaction between person and environment in understanding and further advancing the prediction of individual behavior. And essentially, he proposed this mathematical looking formula, but it all boils down to behavior as a function of person and environment. So again, he emphasized that in order for us to further understand or accurately understand individual behavior, we really need to consider both personal characteristics, which also include subjective perceptions of one's environment, as well as environmental characteristics. So to me, as organizational psychologist, this formula resonated quite deeply because I was always interested in, as an organizational psychologist, we are essentially tasked with creating an environment that is conducive for high performing, motivation, as well as employee well-being. And I was always curious with the P portion of this equation and thinking, how do subjective perceptions interact or relate to this objective reality that we're trying to create for our employees in organizations? So thinking about this perception, one of the aspects that influence how we perceive an environment, how we evaluate our environment, boils down to social comparison. So that's where I was bringing in your peer who, or your colleague who received $1,000 as compared to $100. How do you feel about that $100 now when you have that comparison? So as human beings, we have a tendency to look at others, to evaluate our own circumstances, to evaluate our own outcomes. And we know that the result of this social comparison is going to have an impact on a variety of life and work outcomes. What we know that the discrepancy that result from these comparisons are going to also have an impact on how we feel and how we evaluate our outcomes. And they're going to impact our well-being, our behavior, our motivations, and so forth. And of course, the size of that discrepancy that results from the inequitable comparisons is also going to have an outcome. So here I'm specifically indicating the employee perceiving discrepancies, but it also works in a variety of contexts, not just in the workplace. So related to social comparison, to explain how social comparisons can impact us specifically, is equity theory that brings into the focus the direction of that discrepancy or inequity, in other words. So the assumption behind equity theory is that we are highly motivated by fairness. So we are motivated to achieve and maintain the fair balance between our inputs and our outputs. And that inequity is going to impact us negatively. So I will take you to the next slide to define more specific examples of inputs and outputs as related to various possible outcomes. So in the context of a workplace, it could be looked at promotion. So the outcome that we want is the promotion. And so when examining how we view not receiving the promotion, we generally consider, well, what we put in, our inputs, what kind of work, motivation, effort we put in into getting the promotion. But in addition to simply comparing our inputs and outputs, we also, in order to identify whether the ratio, whether our inputs and outcomes ratios fair, we will look at others and we will look, well, how much input they put in into their work and their outcome, the promotion. And so if everything is about equal, I didn't come to work on time, I didn't take extra assignments, I didn't help my colleagues, and I didn't get the promotion. However, somebody else who put more effort into their work that year received the promotion, the ratio is equal. So even though the outcome was quite not what I was hoping for, the ratio of my effort and outcome was equitable to my comparison point. And so the equity in this case is predicted to not harm me and to lead to positive outcomes, to result in positive outcomes, and not really stress me out or cause dissatisfaction with my job or maybe even turnover intentions and so forth. So then we can also have negative inequity. We also can refer to this as unfavorable inequity. So in unfavorable inequity is the ratios are not favorable to individual who is engaging in those social comparisons. So if I put more effort than my peer, but I didn't receive the same level of outcome, praise, promotion, salary increase, and so forth, that somebody who put less effort, then it's unfavorable comparison to me. It's unfavorable inequity. Of course, inequity could also work in a different way. So positive inequity, we also refer to that sometimes as overpaying condition, over-rewarded condition. So essentially when putting less effort and receiving more outcomes than my comparison counterparts. So that's a favorable to me comparison. I don't have to work as hard as some others to receive more outcomes or more outputs. According to equity theory, because we are motivated by fairness, both negative and positive inequity, so favorable or unfavorable comparisons, both of those conditions should negatively impact my levels of well-being, my levels of satisfaction, my levels of stress, and so forth. So according to this theory, our optimal function and positive outcomes are expected in equity, even if equity is not quite favorable, not quite what we want. But if, as long as it's fair, when we look at others, we're going to be that fairness is going to mitigate the negative impact of maybe something that us not achieving whatever outcomes we want. And even with favorable conditions, we will have the dissonance, we'll have this tension, and we will be motivated to reduce it. We will be negatively impacted even by favorable condition. Not surprisingly, research provided support for the equity condition for favorable as well, for favorable inequity as well. So what we find, however, is the strength of the relationship for favorable and unfavorable comparisons with negative outcomes is slightly different. So unfavorable comparisons are going to have stronger impact on our well-being, negative impact on our well-being, than favorable comparisons would. However, in general, research is still demonstrating that equity is better than even favorable comparisons because of our drive and motivation for fair conditions and fair comparisons. So today we'll talk to you about this congruency and discrepancy in three different contexts. So individual context, congruency or incongruency in justice perceptions, organizational context in relation to psychological climate perceptions, and cultural context. So incongruency in person, environment, values. Incongruency in justice perception is concerned with our individual level variable, belief in a just world. So it is an individual difference variable. It's our predisposition to believe that the world is a fair and just world. And so we differ in that perception. Some of us view the world as a fair and a just place, and some of us not so much. What we also know about this particular variable is that our justice beliefs can be in relation to specifically us. So that's essentially would be me asking you a question. Do you think the world is treating you fairly? Do you think what you have in this world is fair, your outcomes, and then how you achieve that? Also, so that would be procedural justice beliefs, fair. But we also have general justice beliefs. That's essentially me would be asking you a question. Do you believe the world in general towards others, a fair and just world? And what we find is that those are two separate dimensions of this particular construct. And people can have different views on that. So it is possible for somebody to believe that the world is fair, is treating them fairly, and that what they have is fair, but it's not quite a fair world towards others, and vice versa. And so we were curious to consider how the comparisons and possible discrepancy between the two, since we know the discrepancy is possible, can have an impact. So previous research have looked significantly in the protective mechanisms and potentially negative outcomes of these separate beliefs. And what we found is that personal justice beliefs do predict personal well-being. So if I view the world as a fair place, I am going to be less stressed out, report higher levels of psychological well-being than those who don't view the world as a very fair place for them. Now, with general justice beliefs, we find that those are predictive not of a personal well-being, but of the attitudes towards others. So they have been connected towards attitudes towards outgroups, so poor, immigrants. And so essentially having lower levels of justice perceptions towards others, so in general, predicts the harsher social attitudes towards other groups, including stigmatized groups. However, what we wanted to look in specifically, not at how each of these dimensions are predicting various outcomes, but whether the inequity, the discrepancy in those perceptions, hence using social comparison theory, will actually be predictive of one's levels of well-being or their attitudes towards various stigmatized groups. And so essentially we hypothesize the following here is that when there will be a congruency in justice beliefs and congruency on the entire level of it, so high levels of justice beliefs for self combined with high levels of justice beliefs for others or general just beliefs, including low, we will have highest well-being, so fewer physical symptoms, and more inclusive social attitudes, so less hostility towards the poor. And then there's a greater discrepancy. So in a condition where we have the discrepancy, we will see lower levels of well-being and harsher social attitudes. And of course, with greater discrepancy resulting in more diminished well-being and harsher social attitudes. We also wanted to double check those revised assumptions of social equity theory, where the type of discrepancy will also have some mitigating effects. And looking at other favorable discrepancy, hypothesizing that if the unfavorable comparisons would actually have even stronger impact on our physical well-being and on social attitudes. And so the next slide just gives you a very high level information on our sample. It was a US-based sample research, so one is all across the United States, and the other sample was specifically relying on Michigan residents. And we measured the dispositional beliefs about justice, measuring personal and distributive towards self, so personal distributive justice beliefs and general distributive justice beliefs. We skipped the procedural justice beliefs for this study for a variety of reasons. We focused only on those two. We measured attitudes, poverty attitudes, favorable or unfavorable, and self-reported health. So it was a physical health, however, it was self-reported questionnaire. So I included those slides. So I included the graphs to demonstrate that we did conduct the statistical analysis, but don't worry about it. I will essentially verbalize what is happening here without going into too much details. We did find support for both of our hypotheses. What we found is that when you have the congruency between justice beliefs, regardless for self and others, so personal and general, regardless of whether they were low justice beliefs versus high justice beliefs, we found that the negative outcomes were the lowest. So highest levels of physical well-being and lowest levels of social harsh attitudes. So most benevolent attitudes were reported, which was very interesting because, again, when we're not considering the discrepancy between justice beliefs, what we find is that low levels of justice beliefs are generally negative for us, be it personally for us or be it in relation to social attitudes. However, what we see is that even having low justice beliefs, if they're in alignment for self and others, is not going to be as harmful as having the discrepancy between the two. And so what we found is that as soon as discrepancy is taking place and becoming larger and larger, we see the diminishing in physical health and harshness of attitudes towards the poor being increased and increased. So poverty attitudes being reported as harsher, as more negative. And so we also found the support for the hypothesis that, yes, indeed, the unfavorable inequity has even stronger negative effect. But again, the key finding here is that combination of low justice beliefs, that originally low justice beliefs would be believed to be a negatively impacting people, is still not as bad if they're equally low across for both personal and a general consideration. And so we found the support for the equity for social comparisons as specifically and the outcomes, the results of those social comparisons as predicted by equity theory. The next study also considered the same assumptions, but looked within organizational context as opposed to individual context with individual and social outcomes, and looking at incongruency in psychological climate perceptions. So at the very high level, psychological climate is defined as subjective perceptions of the work environment. And so again, that's the p-value of the equation. So there's an objective environment, but how do we perceive? Will it make a difference? And so we do know that based on research, subjective perceptions of the work environment do have impact on a variety of important work outcomes. Job satisfaction, engagement, productivity, and the list can go on. However, within psychological climate, similar to just world belief concept, there are two frames of references that have been considered. So again, environment as pertaining to me. So do I see environment as favorable to me versus environment as organizational in general. So personal and organizational, individual and organizational focused, psychological climate, PCI and PCO. So again, it's very similar in the sense that individual-focused climate is considering my own situation and how I experience organization, and organizational-focused is still focusing on my perceptions of organizational environment, but my assumptions and perceptions of how others experience the same environment. And not surprisingly, those are not always in alignment. So using equity theory, we were able to make similar prediction. So there could be congruent perceptions. So I can perceive my work environment, my climate as favorable to me and to others. But I also can have congruently negative experiences. So I perceive it as not favorable to me, but also not favorable to others. So I experience an organizational environment in a negative way, but I also perceive others experience it similarly to me in a negative way. So again, that congruency could be positive, negative, and anywhere in between. And then, of course, it is possible to have discrepant views. So I could have favorable to myself views where I see environment as more favorable to me than to others in this organization, and I have unfavorable to myself. So I experience environment as negative, but I see others as experiencing environment more positive than I do. And of course, similar to just world beliefs, if we go on by assumptions of based, if we're basing our predictions on assumptions of equity theory, we will focus on discrepancy as being negative, whether favorable or unfavorable in relation to my job outcomes. So again, the idea behind it is that congruent perceptions, favorable or unfavorable, still will be better than incongruency, including unfavorable incongruency. And so based on that, we made this specific hypothesis that I essentially just mentioned. And specifically, the outcome we were interested in was job satisfaction. So congruent views, regardless positive or negative, will be associated with highest levels of job satisfaction, where degree of discrepancy would be predictive of job satisfaction, and specifically greater the discrepancy, lower levels of job satisfaction. And we expected it for any direction, but we were also looking at whether unfavorable comparisons would have the most negative impact as opposed to favorable comparisons. And sample size was also quite large. These were employees of non-government, non-for-profit organization. It was a paper survey. We had over 600 participants, and essentially we measured individual and organizational focused psychological climate. We also measured job satisfaction. And similar graph, but flipped a little bit because, again, because of the directionality of the measures, but we see the same graph here supporting the assumptions of the same shape of the graph that supports the assumptions of revised equity theory. So along the congruency line, regardless equally low or equally high perceptions of environment for ourselves, work environment for ourselves and others, we see the highest levels of job satisfaction. And as soon as we move along the incongruency or discrepancy line, where we get into this unfavorable or favorable comparisons, but essentially perceiving environment as experienced differently by me and my counterparts, my peers, we see the negative impact on job satisfaction, with, of course, the lowest job satisfaction reported by people who reported unfavorable comparisons. So we see here the idea that our job satisfaction is not just impacted strictly by how I view environment towards myself, but it is directly impacted by my conclusions, my comparisons, and the discrepancy, potential discrepancy from those comparisons of how I view others experiencing the same environment. I'll talk about implications in a little bit after I discuss the third study. So slightly moving into slightly different congruency or fit is discussion of incongruency with person environment and specifically culture. So in third study, I was interested in how individual fits into environment. So it's comparison or congruency, but now between a person and their characteristics and the environment within which they function. So again, person-environment fit emphasizes the importance of that congruency, correspondence between individual characteristics and characteristics of the environment, and it has been linked to a variety of outcomes. So it's leveraging that person-environment fit, and researchers have studied fit in relation to individual characteristics, values, goals, preferences, personality, knowledge, skills, and abilities, and so forth. And they also studied it in relation to different environments, so community, person to person, job, groups, organizations, vacations, occupations, and including culture. So I was specifically interested in person-culture fit. When you look at cross-cultural research, we treat within culture variability in our values and personalities as an error, as something that is not meaningful. And we lump people together to define a culture. And I was curious, how can we leverage this, what we refer in cultural research as error, uh, into something meaningful? Because my values are still predictive of my behavior and outcomes. And just because I'm in a particular culture doesn't mean that my deviation from generally espoused cultural values are not going to be impactful. So in the context of research, we consider those as error values, but in reality, they're not. And so I was going to look at individual level values and the fit between the cultural context within which those values now functioning. And so person culture fit refers to congruence of individual values and perceptions and the values and perceptions of the culture within this person is functioning. And specifically in this context, I was interested in international students and expatriates. There are several theories that explain why it's important. So cognitive dissonance theory, when I'm expected to act in a way that is not consistent with my values. So if I'm following cultural expectations, it will cause me cognitive dissonance. It will cause me the discomfort. It will be more cognitively demanding for me, and therefore relate to some negative outcomes for me. And cultural distance hypothesis also predicting that when two cultures are similar, so person going from a similar culture to going from one culture to another culture that is similar to their original culture, they will be less distressed and will show better adjustment. So I thought, okay, if we have culture value similarity, why not to look at congruency between individual values and cultural values of the host country? And so I looked specifically at cultural adjustment of international students. And I looked at 3 dimensions where we have general adjustment, interaction adjustment, and work adjustment. So general adjustment, how well I feel I can function with certain level of comfort, just doing grocery shopping, asking for directions, navigating my overall life in the host culture. Interaction adjustment refers to comfort of communication with host nationals. And of course, work adjustment is how well and comfortable I am there to perform my duties. In the context of international students, it is, of course, doing the studies. I looked specifically at 2 values, collectivism and power distance. And host culture specifically in my study was US. So US is considered to be low on in-group collectivism, so it's highly individualistic culture, and it's medium on power distance. So power distance meaning the formality of interactions between people within different hierarchies. So in the context of grad students, that could be deans, administration, and professors, and so forth. And so what I essentially predicted that people, regardless of which culture they're coming from, if they have values aligned with those of US values, that's what's going to predict the adjustment. So essentially, low in-group collectivism on the individual level will result in higher levels of adjustment and moderate levels of power distance. I had over 500 graduate. I specifically looked at master level and PhD level students, and across 73 countries, and measured their cross-cultural adjustment as specified by those 3 dimensions. And again, I used the US culture scores from a well-established international study to identify the scores. Individual value preferences were measured for each individual, and those were compared with the scores on for US culture, essentially. So what I found, interestingly enough, so what I found is actually lack of support for my hypothesis. So when I looked at culture scores for US and compared them to individual scores, the fit, the congruency did not predict better adjustment. So I looked at the exploratory fact. I conducted exploratory analysis trying to identify what happened. And what I found is that Globe study, where I got the scores for US culture from, also had scores on preferred. So essentially, to get the scores, the Globe study not only asked people about culture as is, they asked people about, well, how would you like it to be? What is the preference towards which you are striving? And what they found is that in US, there is a preference for lower power distance. And what I found is that people who individually identified themselves as preferring lower power distance, so they were low on power distance, adjusted really well to US culture. So essentially, the fit was not between culture as this, but between host culture preferred and international students that were coming in with that preferred levels of power distance. So of course, it's only one value. The other values were not measured or studied. That would be a really interesting future research specification. But there was still this emergence of congruency and fit. It was just the congruency with preferred way of being in relation to power distance in US. So in general, the implications of this research and many other research studies do show that perceptions of objective environment matter. For organizational psychologists, and for a professor, it's really important to me that in addition to creating objective environment, so focusing on characteristic of an environment, like setup of my classroom, setup of my documentations, or in organizations, creating the specific characteristics of an environment that have been shown to be positively related to positive employee outcomes. I actually have to pay attention to perceptions that people have of this subjective environment. Fit matters. Discrepancy matters between how people view their own situations and how they view others matters. So it has to be measured and considered as well. And the practical implication is that equity and transparency matters. So it's very important to check in on fairness, on equity, and manage those social comparisons in individuals that I'm working with. And that also leads to that frame of reference when we're measuring or considering our interventions or work. Consideration of self and other and how people compare those can be very important. Thank you.
That was a very wonderful presentation, Lucy.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate your presentation. Thank you so much for doing a very beautiful job. Can we have a round of applause for her? Now, it is time for questions. I don't know if you have questions for the presenter. We can now use the next 10 minutes or so if she can respond to those questions. Question time.
Not all at once, please.
Okay, let me just try and see. I am particularly happy that you looked at something on person culture fit.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure if your study mentioned, your study mention misfit? And what will be your recommendation when you have person culture misfit?
Yeah, so even though I use the term congruency or fit, the opposite side of it was misfit. So people who were not aligning their values, that were not aligning with preferred power distance levels for the US, they fared worse. So it was still supporting the idea of fit as an important consideration. And it goes back to cognitive dissonance hypothesis. It goes back to difficulty of acting in a way that is not in line with your values. And so when you're in an environment that is in line with your values, it's easier to adjust to that new environment. Or in this case, particularly with culture, what it was demonstrated, at least in US, that the fit or misfit was actually in relation to how host nationals in US preferred that dimension to be. So there was this preference for lower power distance. And so when they saw somebody coming in and acting in line with values for lower, in line with lower power distance values, so less formal communications, less formal interactions, it was received well and was in line with better adjustment. Work, and we saw that in the study with work, interaction, and general adjustment.
Thank you so much.
Fabricio?
Okay, somebody, yes, you can ask your question, Fabio.
Thank you. Thanks, Lucy, for the really good presentation. Apologies if I missed if you talked about that, but one of the things you mentioned was that there were physical consequences for the students who perceived injustice.
Mm-hmm.
What did you find? Were you able to identify the kinds of physical consequences?
Yes. So in this particular study, it was a self-reported physical check. So it was like basic headaches, knee pain, backache. So it was a physical fatigue. So it was a physical checklist. I do have to say that we have looked at justice beliefs at the dimension level. So simply linking justice beliefs, personal or others, as well as replicating this research, specifically the discrepancy, looking at discrepancy in vulnerable populations. So, for example, African Americans in US, specifically in the Detroit area, as well as with objective physical outcomes. So they were taking stress level measurements, so the blood was examined. I wasn't part of the measurement of the physiological measures of well-being and stress. I was just analyzing data, but essentially we were able to replicate this result of injustice impact and discrepancy impact. We were able to replicate these results with physiological measures of stress. And so, yes, I've also seen work done on linking injustice perceptions to some other not in our work, but to some other physiological outcomes. So I believe, based on evidence, perceptions of injustice have not only impact on our psychological health, but on our physical health.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. One of the interesting aspects of following up research that we've seen, that interestingly enough, the discrepancies, at least in our sample comparing white and black samples in US, the discrepancy, the instances of discrepancy or discrepancies more likely to be in actually black population than white population. So that's also something to consider. Not only discrepancy has a negative impact, we also more likely to see unfavorable discrepancies in those vulnerable populations.
Thank you.
Or like
Lucy, there's a question for you on the chat. Given your finding, what will you recommend to individuals or agencies who approach you interested in building the best environment for their employees or students?
That's a very important question. So essentially, I always keep in mind that perceptions matter. So as much as I can follow the best practices and again, create in the organizational or classroom environments based on evidence that would tell me this is the most conducive to learning environment or practice, checking in with students and seeing their reaction to this environment is important. Also ensuring that fairness, because social comparisons are inevitable. And even if, again, I am doing everything procedurally fair, what is going to take place is the assumptions if students or employees are not aware. So transparency is the key. Transparency in my marking scheme with working with students, transparency in my decision making, transparency in my policies when I'm making exceptions, when I'm not. So that transparency is really important. And checkpoints with students about their perceptions are very important, because just because I'm doing something right, if they don't see it, if they don't know it, if they don't experience it as just and fair, and they're making comparisons, and remember, even favorable comparisons, for most people don't feel good. They're still going to lead to worsen experiences, to lower levels of satisfaction with the classroom, with the learning and whatever else, higher levels of stress. And so even favorable comparisons, even if students think that they're favored, might lead to their worsened experience or negative experience in the classroom. So it's checking in and making sure they are aware that where I'm coming from with my decisions. It's transparent and fair. Perceptions are powerful indeed.
Okay, there's one more question for you, Lucy. Is there a way we can have a preparatory program before people join organization or even students before they join school? How realistic will that be? Preparing the minds of employees or students before they come in. Is it realistic?
Preparatory program in terms of
employees before they join organization or before students enter a particular kind of school. Is it realistic to prepare the minds of would-be employees or would-be students?
I don't think so. I think it's a so I feel so as an organizational psychologist, I'm very cautious to put any type of responsibility or accountability on students or on employees when it comes to organizational higher level structure. So even the classroom or university, this is something that students come into or employees come into. They do bring their own values. They bring their so basically, I feel that it's companies and professors and administration responsibility to ensure the transparency, to ensure clarity of communications. However, where we can also help with this congruencies and fit is the realistic expectations. So in the organizational context, we're really working hard on creating realistic job previews. So job descriptions that are really clear, in communications about the company with prospective employees, the discussions of what does it mean to work here, what are we value, what are we expecting you to bring. So again, creating clear expectations of what it's like to be, so employees can decide, or prospective employees, whether this will be a good environment for them. So with the universities, it could be the same thing, and with classrooms, telling students right away, what does it feel like? What is the culture here? What are the expectations? So again, if we have that clear outline where students can decide, or employees, about fit and congruency, that would be very helpful, and that should be done. And I think
thank you so
thank you
so much. We don't have much time again. This is where we'll have to end today's presentation. Thank you once again for those who have
Thanks everyone.
taken your time to join us. Thank you. Bye.